Hello, welcome to Learn English with Technology podcast series, episode 12, Amazing Road Trip Language Learning Success Stories. Today, we're going to be exploring a really fascinating approach to learning English, road trips. Just imagine turning your car into this language learning powerhouse, where like every billboard and rest stop, even just conversations you have, they all become opportunities to enhance your English skills. We've got a whole stack of incredible real-life stories, research from neuroscientists, and a bunch of creative techniques, all focused on how you can turn your next road trip into a truly immersive English learning experience.
You know, what's really fascinating about this whole idea is that it's not just like some quirky learning hack or anything. There's actual research from neuroscience that backs up how effective learning on the go can be.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. What is it about road trips that makes them such fertile ground for language learning?
Well, you know, studies from places like, what was it? Stanford University have shown that our brains actually, they form stronger neural connections when we're in motion. It's like our minds are just primed to absorb new information when we're traveling. And this is especially true during long distance drives.
So it's not just me then. I've always felt like my brain just kind of goes into overdrive when I'm on the open road, you know?
Exactly. You're in this state of relaxed alertness, you know?
Yeah.
The scenery's changing, you've got that rhythmic hum of the engine, and it creates what some researchers are calling a cognitive sweet spot for learning.
I'm starting to see how even a traffic jam could become like a productive language learning session now.
You got it. And studies have even shown that people who learn languages while they're traveling,
Right.
they actually have significantly higher retention rates compared to people using, more traditional classroom methods.
Wow, that's impressive. What is it that's happening in the brain that makes such a big difference?
It all comes down to this concept called contextual anchoring. So instead of just memorizing lists of vocabulary words in a boring classroom,
Yeah.
you're linking those new words and phrases to vivid experiences and
Yeah.
to specific places. Just think about it. If you use a new idiom in English in a conversation at a diner in some new city you're visiting, that's going to create a much stronger memory than if you had just read it in a textbook, you know?
It's almost like the whole world becomes your own personalized language lab.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of what we call immersive automation either. As you're constantly exposed to English during this road trip, your brain gradually shifts from translating everything to actually just thinking in English.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's like you're not just passively taking in information anymore. You're actually actively using it to navigate the world around you.
Precisely. And there's actually another surprising element that can enhance your learning on the road too. Driving fatigue. As long as you're driving safely, of course. But that slight fatigue you get from being behind the wheel for a long time, that can actually put your brain into a state similar to right before you fall asleep.
Hold on. Isn't that when we're supposed to be most likely to get into accidents?
Yes, absolutely. Safety always has to come first. But research has shown that in that kind of drowsy state, as long as we're still alert enough to drive responsibly, our brains actually become super receptive to new information. It's like a sponge soaking up everything around it.
So you're saying those long stretches on the highway, those could actually be the best time for absorbing all that new vocabulary and grammar.
That's exactly what I'm saying. Road trips can create this really unique mental state that's perfect for effortlessly acquiring new language skills.
It's all very encouraging, but I'm really eager to hear how this all works in practice. You mentioned earlier that we had some inspiring stories.
We do. So let me introduce you to Sarah. She's a software engineer and a mom of two, and she basically transformed her family's cross-country road trip into this epic English language learning adventure.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. How did she manage to pull this off?
Well, Sarah's preparation was meticulous. She went all out, and she turned her family's SUV into what her kids ended up calling the English Adventure Mobile.
Okay, I need to hear more about this. What did she actually do?
Just picture this. She designated different areas within the car as zones of genius. Each zone was dedicated to different types of learning activities. For example, the front passenger seat, that became the radio DJ zone, and her family members would take turns hosting their own English language radio shows, complete with music and news, even weather reports.
That's amazing. What a great way to keep everyone engaged and having fun, especially during those long drives. Do they only use apps and digital resources for their learning?
No, actually, Sarah took a more, I guess you could call it a more analog approach. She created this thing she called a geographical learning map. She did all this research on the different accents they would encounter and the local expressions and cultural elements of every region they were planning to drive through. And she actually tailored their learning materials to each of those places.
That's incredible. So their learning was directly connected to the actual places they were visiting. Did she have any strategies for dealing with like unexpected situations? Because those always come up on road trips.
Of course. Sarah actually prepared what she called emergency language kits for all kinds of scenarios. These kits had pre-prepared phrases, vocabulary cards, and even like role play scenarios, so they'd be ready to handle things like ordering food, asking for directions, or even explaining a car problem to a mechanic, all in English.
It's like she gamified the entire road trip, turning every rest stop and every little interaction into this learning opportunity.
That's a great way to put it. She really did. And it wasn't even just about surviving these situations, it was about really thriving in them, using English confidently and correctly in real world contexts.
This is really making me realize that road trips aren't just about getting to some destination, but about embracing the journey along the way.
And learning along the way. We haven't even touched on the awesome tech setup she created, or the really clever way she worked with the family dynamics, and all the surprising ways they turned challenges into learning opportunities.
Okay, I'm hooked. I definitely want to hear more about all those details. What other surprises does Sarah have in store for us?
We'll get ready to hear about the three-screen symphony, the road trip radio station, and my favorite, the Zeritech backup plan. It just goes to show how much we can really achieve with a little creativity and a willingness to think outside the box. In the last part, we were talking about that cognitive sweet spot
Mm.
that our brains can get into when we're on the move. Well, Sarah really took advantage of that with the routine her family followed.
Oh, yeah, I remember. So what kind of learning schedule did they actually use on their trip?
So they actually based their learning around the natural rhythm of their road trip, starting each day with something they called morning magic. For about 15 minutes or so, they'd just listen to English music, something kind of calming, as everyone was waking up.
That's really nice. What was the purpose of that?
Sarah actually found that those drowsy moments right after you wake up, those are really effective for just kind of passively soaking up new vocabulary. Your brain's relaxed, not quite fully alert yet, and it's really ready to just absorb new sounds and patterns.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like when you have a song playing in the background, and you don't even realize you're learning the lyrics.
Exactly. And they would play the same song every morning for a whole week. By the end of the trip, even Sarah's 4-year-old was singing along to these complex English lyrics
Mm.
without even realizing that he was actually learning new words and grammar.
That's so smart. It's like sneaking in the language learning before the kids even know what's happening. What did they do once everyone was fully awake and had some energy?
That's when they would do the sunrise sprint. For the first 2 hours of driving, when everyone was feeling fresh and alert, they'd play this really fast-paced vocabulary game they called speed vocab.
Speed vocab. What is that?
It was actually pretty simple, but really effective for learning new words. Basically, they would take turns, and they had to quickly name, in English, everything they could see outside the car window, like cars, trees, signs, buildings, anything and everything.
So whoever could name the most things in English before someone else jumped in, they won.
Yeah, pretty much. It kept everyone engaged, and it really expanded their vocabulary, and it actually became a challenge that ran throughout the whole trip, with each of them trying to beat their own word count record from earlier.
I bet those scores got pretty high, especially when they were driving through cities. Did they only do activities focused on vocabulary?
Oh no, they had a lot of different things they did to keep it interesting and to make sure they were using different learning styles. One of their favorite things was podcast theater.
Oh, wow. What's that?
Basically, they would take podcasts they were listening to and turn them into these little interactive performances. Each family member would pretend to be a different character from the podcast, even trying to copy their accents and how they talked.
That's hilarious. I bet that got pretty funny with all the different accents. Did they change up what they were doing based on where they were driving?
Yeah, they actually got pretty strategic about that. When they were on the highway with all that open road, that was when they would do more listening or have longer conversations.
Makes sense. You can really get into a topic when you've got all that time. What about when they were driving through cities? Where there's more traffic and stoplights and stuff.
Oh, that's when they would practice their pronunciation. They'd focus on specific sounds, work on tongue twisters. They even tried to copy the accents of people they saw and heard around them.
So even those frustrating traffic jams became chances to improve their English.
I like that. Did they use those rest stops that you have to take on every road trip for learning too?
Of course, Sarah actually called rest stops language missions. At each stop, everyone had to do something specific, like ordering food in English, or asking for directions, sometimes even starting conversations with other travelers.
That's a great way to test out their skills in the real world. It's one thing to practice in the car, but it's totally different to actually use your English with other people.
Exactly. And for Sarah, these language missions weren't just about getting by in those situations, but about being confident and using their English in a natural way to connect with people and to handle new situations.
I love that. Did they ever get frustrated when they would run into challenges,
Yeah.
especially when they were trying to use their English with real people?
Oh, they definitely had their moments.
Yeah.
But Sarah came up with this clever thing she called the Emotional English Toolkit.
An emotional English toolkit.
Yes, it's
It was a bunch of strategies that would help them deal with all those feelings that you get on a long road trip. Like frustration and tiredness, maybe even boredom sometimes. And they would use these strategies to make those feelings into something positive.
so they weren't just learning English words and grammar, but also how to use English to talk about their feelings
Yeah,
and to deal with tough situations.
exactly. Like if they were starting to get grumpy, they'd play this game called Feeling Description Derby, where they each had to describe how they were feeling in English, but in a super dramatic and funny way.
It's brilliant.
Hmm.
It's hard to stay in a bad mood when you're trying to say something like, I'm utterly devastated by this unexpected detour in a British accent.
Right. And then at the end of each day, as the sun was setting, they would do sunset summary, which was their time to talk about everything they had learned that day. They'd share any new words or phrases that they liked and talk about any problems they ran into. And they'd always end by celebrating how much progress they had made.
It sounds like they were really focused on making it a positive experience
Yeah.
and being encouraging to each other, even though they were stuck in a car together.
They really were. And they even kept this journal they called the Victory Journal. It was like a diary of their trip and their language learning,
Hmm.
where they wrote down all their accomplishments and funny moments and just their thoughts about how they were doing with their English.
This is really inspiring. It shows how language learning can be a part of our everyday lives and how we can turn even ordinary things like a family road trip into chances to grow and connect.
I completely agree. It's about noticing those moments and
Yes.
making those spaces for learning and enjoying the process. But we've only just scratched the surface here. We haven't talked about how they use technology to help them learn or how they all learned together as a family.
Okay, I'm definitely ready to hear more about all that. What other creative strategies did Sarah and her family come up with?
Well, get ready to hear about the Family Roles Revolution, the Milestone Missions, and the Family Podcast Project, which is honestly so heartwarming. It's a great example of how powerful it can be to learn together, especially as a family. So one of the things Sarah did that I think was so smart was how she took those potential challenges that can come up with family dynamics and she turned them into, learning opportunities. She called it the Family Roles Revolution.
Okay, I'm really curious to hear about this. How did she handle all the different roles and responsibilities within the family, especially when it came to learning?
Well, instead of having that traditional teacher-student dynamic,
Mm.
where the parents are always the ones teaching and the kids are the ones learning, she came up with this system where everyone got to take on different roles in their English learning adventure.
So it was more like a collaborative learning experience where everybody was contributing and learning from each other.
Exactly. They even came up with these fun characters to go with each role, like Professor Pronunciation, Vocabulary Victor, and Grammar Guardian. And they even had silly props and costumes they found along the way.
That's so cute. I bet the kids really loved that. Did it actually help them learn, though? Or was it mostly just for fun?
Oh, it was definitely a lot of fun, but it also had a really important purpose. You see, by changing roles all the time, it kept things interesting, and everyone felt like they were really a part of the learning. So whoever was wearing the Professor Pronunciation glasses, which were really just sunglasses turned upside down,
Yeah.
they had the power to correct anyone's English, even mom and dad's.
That's hilarious. I can just imagine all the teasing that must have led to.
Oh, there was definitely a lot of laughter. It created this really fun and supportive environment where everyone felt okay with trying new things and making mistakes along the way. And speaking of making learning fun, they had this brilliant way of dealing with those long stretches of highway driving. Those parts that can sometimes get a little boring. Sarah called them milestone missions.
Milestone missions. Tell me more about that.
Okay, so instead of hearing the usual "are we there yet" complaints, they turned all those distances and state lines into these language learning challenges. They would plan these vocabulary games for every time they crossed a state line. Or they'd make up these storytelling games that had to last until they reached the next rest stop.
So it's like they turned the whole road trip into one giant game board,
Yeah,
and every milestone was a new chance to learn.
you got it. And it wasn't just about passing the time, it also made everyone excited about learning. They even had a game called the Great American Word Hunt, where they'd try to be the first one to spot and say a word they saw on a billboard or a sign.
That's such a fun idea. Those long drives must have just flown by. So they were really good at taking those potentially boring moments and turning them into these fun learning experiences. Did they ever have any issues with, just being around each other so much in the car?
Of course, no family road trip is perfect, right? Sarah knew that being together in such close quarters for so long could sometimes lead to a little tension. So she created what she called the Emotional English Toolkit.
Hmm, that sounds interesting. What was in this toolkit?
Basically, it was a set of strategies to
Whoa.
help them deal with those times when they might be feeling frustrated or tired or maybe even annoyed with each other. And they would use these strategies to work through those feelings, but in a way that helped them practice their English.
So they weren't just learning English words and grammar,
Mm.
but also how to communicate better and how to handle those tricky situations that come up when you're with family.
You got it. Like when things started getting a little tense, they would play this game called Feeling Description Derby. Everyone had to describe how they were feeling at that moment, but they had to do it in English and in the most dramatic and funniest way they could think of.
That's amazing. They really found ways to turn even the tough moments into learning opportunities.
So, besides all that, did they have any other family-focused activities that stood out to you? Yeah, one of the most successful things they did was the Family Podcast Project. Every day, each family member would record a little 5-minute segment for their own family podcast, and they'd talk about their experiences and what they were thinking. All in English, of course.
That's so cool. I bet they had a blast making their own podcast. What kind of things did they talk about in their episodes?
Oh, all sorts of things, like the best roadside attractions we saw today, or the weirdest license plates we spotted, and even what we learned about English today.
It's like they created their own little audio time capsule of their trip, not just to
Yeah.
the places they went, but also of their own growth and how they were getting better at English.
I know, it's really sweet. And when you listen back to those recordings now, you can really hear how much their confidence grew and how much more fluent they became in just a few weeks.
This has been such an inspiring deep dive. I'm so glad we got to learn about Sarah and her family and their amazing language learning adventure. They've really shown us that learning doesn't have to be stuck in textbooks and classrooms. It can happen anywhere, at any time, especially if we're willing to be adventurous and think outside the box.
I couldn't agree more. They've reminded us that the best learning experiences often happen when we get out of our comfort zones and embrace those unexpected moments and just really enjoy the journey.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing all these incredible insights with us today. And to our listeners, we hope you feel inspired to try out some road trip language learning yourselves. Remember, you don't need a fancy car or a ton of equipment to get started. All you need is a curious mind, a willingness to try new things, and that desire to turn your next trip into a language learning adventure. And if you're feeling inspired, we'd love to hear about your own language learning experiences. So share your stories, your tips, and your questions in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this episode with anyone who might be ready to turn their next road trip into a language learning adventure. Until next time, happy learning.